My name is Amara. I am 39 years old and I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, the second of 5 children in a family where ambition was not optional. It was the air we breathed. My mother was a school teacher and my father ran a small printing business, and together they raised 5 children with the shared understanding that education was the only door that opened reliably from the inside. I believed that completely. I built my entire life on it. And then, at 31 years old, sitting in a hospital corridor in Houston, Texas, I found out that the man I had built that life with had been lying to me about something so fundamental that I had to go back and re-examine every single year we had shared together to understand what had been real. His name was Amika. We met in graduate school at the University of Lagos, both of us in the economics department. Both of us the kind of students who sat in the front row, not to impress the professor, but because we genuinely could not hear well enough from the back. He was from Enugu, I was from Lagos, and in Nigeria, that difference matters in ways that are complicated to explain to people who didn't grow up there. Different cultures, different languages underneath the English, different family expectations. My mother was cautious about him for reasons she expressed diplomatically and meant seriously. My father said, "If he is hardworking and honest, that is enough." My father was, in this instance, half right. We got married when I was 26, after 3 years together and a courtship that my aunties described as too slow, and my mother described as sensible. The wedding was in Lagos, 400 people, 2 days of celebrations, and my grandmother danced in a way that made everyone around her stop and watch. We moved to Houston the following year for Emeka's PhD program in economics at Rice University, and I transferred my own graduate studies to the University of Houston and worked part-time as a research assistant, and we lived in a small apartment near the campus that was always slightly too hot in summer and slightly too cold in winter, and that I loved with the particular affection you have for the first place you and someone build something together. Houston was a different kind of life. Not bad, different. The Nigerian community there was large and warm and immediately welcoming in the way of people who understand what it costs to be far from home. We had friends, we had community, we had each other. And for several years, that felt like enough to build on. Emeka finished his PhD. I finished my master's. We both found work. Him at an economic consulting firm, me at a research institute studying healthcare policy, which had become my particular interest because of something I will get to in a moment. We bought a house in a suburb called Sugarland, a beige house on a quiet street with a backyard that I planted with tomatoes and peppers, and the kind of stubborn hopefulness that immigrants bring to gardens in climates that are not quite right for what they are trying to grow. What I have not told you yet is that Amika and I had been trying to have children since the second year of our marriage. 5 years of trying, which is a long time to carry a hope that keeps not arriving, a long time to absorb the monthly disappointment and put it somewhere manageable and keep going. We had been through 2 rounds of IVF by the time we bought the house in Sugarland. Neither had worked. Our doctor, a calm woman named Dr. Ose, who was also Nigerian and who I had chosen partly for that reason, had been honest with us about the statistics without being unkind about the odds. We were still trying. We were still hoping. It was becoming the background radiation of our life together, present in everything, named less and less often as time went on. In the 5th year of trying, Amika started to change. Not dramatically. I want to be careful about this because it was not dramatic. It was the same kind of slow tide going out that I think is the hallmark of a particular kind of trouble in a marriage, the kind that has been building underground for a long time before it surfaces. He became quieter. He spent more evenings at the office, or said he did. He was present physically and somewhere else in his attention. And when I asked if everything was all right, he said yes, always yes. Work was demanding. He was tired. He was fine. I told myself it was the fertility stress, that it was affecting both of us differently, that he was a man who processed difficulty inward where I processed it in conversation, and that this was a difference between us I had always known, and this was simply that difference under greater pressure. I told myself these things in the patient, careful voice I had developed over years of being a researcher, the voice that looks for the most reasonable explanation and holds it until the evidence requires otherwise. The evidence arrived on a Tuesday evening in October when Amika called me from what he said was a work dinner to tell me he would be home late. An hour later, I got a call from Houston Methodist Hospital. Amika had been brought into the emergency room. A car accident, not serious, he was stable, but they needed family. I drove to the hospital so fast I cannot account for the route I took. He was in a curtained bay in the emergency department when I arrived, a gash on his forehead being closed by a nurse, more shaken than injured. He looked at me when I walked in with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not relief, not gratitude, something more complicated and more frightened than either. I sat beside him and held his hand and said, "You're okay, you're okay." And he closed his eyes and said, "Amara, I have to tell you something." There was a woman in the waiting room. Her name was Christine. She was American, 34, a project manager at a firm that worked with Amika's company. She had been in the car with him. She was unhurt, but had stayed, the nurse told me quietly when I stepped outside the curtain for a moment, because she wanted to make sure he was all right. I walked to the waiting room. Christine stood up when she saw me. She was tall, with short, natural hair and an expression of someone who had been preparing for this moment and was discovering that preparation did not make it easier. She said, "You must be Amara." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say to you." I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said, "How long?" She said, 14 months. I walked back to the emergency bay. I sat down next to my husband. I held his hand again, not because I wanted to, but because my body did it before my mind caught up. 14 months of habit moving on its own. He was looking at me with the same frightened expression. I said very quietly, so the nurse couldn't hear, "I just spoke with Christine." And all of the air went out of him at once. I did not cry in the hospital. I drove home after Amika was discharged. He came with me, not knowing what else to do, and I did not tell him to stay, and I did not tell him to leave. I simply drove, and he sat in the passenger seat in silence for 40 minutes. And when I got into the house, I went to our bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I stayed there for a long time, doing nothing except breathing and waiting for something inside me to clarify. What I felt in those hours, was not what I expected to feel. I had imagined, in the abstract, in the terrible way that you sometimes imagine worst cases in order to feel prepared for them, the betrayal would feel like rage. Instead, it felt like grief, immediate and total, the way grief feels when something is suddenly and irreversibly over. Not the marriage, not yet. I didn't know yet about the marriage, but the version of Amika I had been married to, the particular certainty I had been living inside. That was over in the way of things that cannot be made unknown. Emeka slept in the guest room. He left early the next morning without waking me. I went to work because I did not know what else to do, and because work had always been the place where I was most completely myself, where the clarity of research and evidence and careful thinking was available to me when everything else was confusion. I sat in my office, and I stared at my screen, and I did not do any work for 3 hours. Then I called my closest friend in Houston, a woman named Folak, who had known us both since the Rice years, and who answered on the first ring and said, "Amara, what happened?" I don't know how she knew. She came to my office at lunchtime, and we sat in my car in the parking garage for 2 hours, and I told her everything, and she listened without flinching and without telling me what to do, which is the only thing you can do for someone in the first 48 hours of something like this. She did say one thing that stayed with me. She said, "Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision and not the decision of the person you think you're supposed to be." I turned that sentence over in my mind for the next several weeks because I understood immediately that it was aimed at something real. I had spent my entire adult life being the person I was supposed to be, the dutiful daughter, the driven student, the resilient immigrant, the patient wife through 5 years of fertility struggles. And all of that was true. And also all of it had taught me to subordinate my own instincts to the version of events that was most manageable. Emeka and I had long, painful conversations in the evenings over the following 2 weeks. The kind of conversations that start at 10 o'clock and end at 2 in the morning with both of you exhausted and nothing resolved, and the truth slightly more visible than it was before. He had ended it with Christine before the hospital, he said. I asked when,